so I'm going to be talking a little bit about AngularJS, which is an open source JavaScript framework from Google. And it's used for when we want to build these sort of rich web applications like Google Maps or Gmail, that sort of thing, right? These applications that really aren't really web pages anymore, right? They're more of like just applications that happen to be running in your browser using HTML and CSS. Oh, and before we get started, if you guys have any questions, feel free just to like yell them out, raise your hand, whatever. I'm happy to try to answer them just during any point in the presentation. So to get started, let's talk about what the problem Angular is trying to solve is. So back when HTML was born in like the early 1990s or so, it was really tough to envision the sort of documents and applications we have today, right? Like in 1993, no one really could have seen Google Maps coming or Google or like was it Google Docs, any of that sort of stuff. So HTML is great at describing static documents, right? If we want to have paragraphs or headings, images, that sort of thing, right? HTML is amazing at doing sort of semantic markup like that. But it becomes really hard when we want to build these like rich web applications, right? We're using JavaScript, we're using HTML, and sort of trying to marry the two, but we can run into problems if we're just using plain old HTML and plain old JavaScript. And our users are really starting to expect these sort of rich applications, right? In the age of like Facebook and that sort of thing, right? They're getting used to this idea that they don't have to wait for a full page load between every single application. And creating these between every single like new request. And creating these large web applications can be a real pain. So just to sort of demo that, I have an example application here. So this is a little web application, and we can type and see just as we type, it's basically updating this label down here. Right? So we can say something like hello world. So this is not a complex application by any stretch of the imagination, right? We basically have our input, and we want the values of the input to show up on the HTML page. And this is the sort of code that might power something like this, right? Just in plain old JavaScript. We have a couple lines of code here. We have just our typical input box and a paragraph tag that we're putting our text in. And then in our JavaScript, we're sort of scanning the document for the input box, right? We're scanning the document and getting the label that we're going to be putting the HTML in. We're attaching an event listener for whenever the user lets go of a key, right? That's this key up right here. And then we have a callback saying, take the value of the text box and set it into the label's text. And that's how we're achieving this sort of functionality like this. And so this is okay, right? Yeah, you can do some things like use jQuery, making a few less lines of code, right? But it's basically still the same thing, right? We have a lot of code where we're looking for elements, right? Manually updating the web page. And it can get really, really hairy when you try to make a more complicated web page, right? As soon as you start adding AJAX requests and updating multiple parts of the page, it can get pretty complex pretty quickly. You can get into this sort of like spaghetti code or callback hell, as it's sometimes called. We just have all these sort of callbacks, like this function here is a callback, right? Callbacks calling other callbacks, and things can sort of collapse under their own weight pretty quickly. So AngularJS has sort of a three-pronged solution for this. The first thing it adds is a model view controller architecture. We're going to get a little bit more into exactly what that is in a bit. It's basically an architecture that helps you keep all your concerns separate, right? You can keep the business logic of your application separate from the HTML you're using to display the results of that business logic. The second thing it introduces is data binding. And data binding is a nice concept. It basically gets rid of all that boilerplate code we saw on the previous slide, where we're sort of searching for elements and then manually updating them. The third thing it does is it actually extends HTML to provide new attributes and HTML tags that are useful for dynamic web applications like we create nowadays. So just to give you a sense of sort of what this looks like, here's the same little web application, this time done with Angular, right? So we have same thing. And so this is all the code for the application in Angular. Of course, there's an AngularJS library we're including on the page as well. But you see, we just have 2 lines, which is basically our markup. So we have our input tag and our paragraph tag again. We have a couple of new attributes that AngularJS is adding. We have this ng model. And so ng stands for sort of the ng in Angular. They prefix all their custom attributes with ng. And so we're saying the model for this input is the variable name. And then our label, we have this curly brace syntax saying output the variable name. So then as we update our input tag, it's updating the variable name, and then that name is being displayed out here. And so this is the concept I mentioned earlier called data binding, right? It's binding to variables. So various parts of our application are binding to variables. So I want to talk a little bit about the model view controller architecture that AngularJS has. So this model view control diagram is just straight from Wikipedia. It's a fairly standard architecture, especially in the sort of UI-based applications, where we have our user, and then he's looking at a view, right? He's looking at the web application, the HTML that we're creating. Behind that is the model, which is the data for our application, whether it's coming from a database or a web service call, that sort of thing. And that model is being, as we change it, it updates the view. And then if you want to interact with the view, right, the user can call the user can perform various actions using the controller to update the model. So this is sort of the abstract concept of a model view controller. To sort of bring it closer to Angular, I have the same sort of diagram, but with some Angular specifics in here. So we have our same old model, view, and controller here. And then we have our user that's interacting with them. So again, you can see this user is interacting with the view, which is just HTML. That view is associated with a model, which via data binding, whenever the model updates, the view updates. And then we have a controller, which can update the model. And the controller can update the model by initially getting the data. So for example, maybe it calls out to a web service and then gets some data back and puts that in the model. And then it can also update the model if the user performs an action. Say they submit a form or something like that, or click a link or click a button, that sort of thing. That'll actually call functions on the controller, which will then update the model. So that's the general sort of interaction model that we have. So as I mentioned before, the view is just HTML, right? We saw that when we had that input form. The controller is just a normal JavaScript function, right? There's no special AngularJS stuff we have to extend, right? That's just normal JavaScript function. And the model is interesting. The model has this $sign scope object. Basically, the $sign scope object is just an empty object, and any data we put into that object is then available for the view to render. And so let's drive this home a little bit by looking at some actual code. So this application right here, let's say I have it up and running somewhere here, which I have a My Favorite Things app, right? So we're just displaying a list of my favorite things, Linux, AngularJS, and uniforms. And so you can see this is the code behind that application. So the first thing we're doing is we're defining a controller. In this case, it's the favorites controller. And it basically just holds a list of our favorite things. So we have this scope object right here. It's being passed into our controller. And we just populate on the scope object things that we want the view to display. So in this case, we're hard coding an array of 3 objects, right? We have our Linux, AngularJS, and uniforms. So that's the controller, and this is the model. So that's like the model and controller part of the MVC. Last up is the view, which in this case is just our body tag. So we have body is our view in this case. We're associating that with the controller. And then within our view, we have access to everything that we put on the scope object. So in this case, favorite things is an array. So we're looping through that array and outputting a list element for each item in the array, and then just outputting that item. So then we have one other little minor tag right there, that ng app. That's basically telling Angular where our app begins. And so in this case, our entire web pages and applications are putting on the root HTML tag. But if you wanted to have that maybe just be a subsection of your application, you could put that on any HTML element you wanted. So we're going to dive a little bit into the controller now. So we have this controller right here. You see we passed in this $sign scope, and it's almost a little bit of magic, right? That we just put this in as a function parameter, and AngularJS knew what to give us. So AngularJS is looking at the names of the variables that we're requesting in our controllers. And then there are several well-defined names. And so for $sign scope, it knows it should give us this scope object that populates, and then makes the data on that scope object available to the view. And so this pattern is called dependency injection. So basically we're not instantiating our objects in our controller. We're just putting our dependencies as parameters, and AngularJS is in charge of giving us those dependencies. There's a couple of other things besides scope we can use. For example, we can use a $log, and AngularJS will inject a log variable that gives us like debug logging and error logging and warning logging. We could ask for maybe a HTTP object, and then we can make AJAX requests from this controller. Using this sort of syntax, we say make a GET request to this API URL, and then on success, execute this function with the data returned from that URL. So to use all three of these together, we could do something like this, where we say just want to get our favorite things from an API as opposed to hard coding them. We can say, we'll go ahead and debug that we're about to make an AJAX call, make an AJAX call, log that we got the response, and then set the favorite things variable on our scope to the favorites that we got back from that API call. All right, and so we talked a little bit about the model, the scope. We can put various pieces of data on our scope to make them available to the view. So we saw before we can have an array, we can have a string, we can really have any sort of JavaScript object we want. We can also have functions, for example. So this is how the user could click something on the view, or maybe click a button or something like that, and then interact with the controller and the model behind the scenes. So we have our favorite things array here, and we have an add favorite function we're defining that just pushes our new favorite thing onto the favorite things array. So let's go ahead and take a little look at this. So we have this same view before, where we had a list of our favorite things. So we had our favorite things variable that was an array, and we're just outputting all of our favorite things. Now we have two new elements. We have our input box, and we have a button you see right here. And our input box is putting its value into the new favorite variable, and then the button click is calling add favorite with our new favorite variable. So we can say something like LXC is one of our new favorite things. We can go ahead and put Linux here, and I guess I'll put unicorns. And I suppose maybe
right. Suppose.
So this is how we can get interactivity in our application, where you can read the data, and then we can also write to the data. So you can see this is how, if you want to have a form or a search box, something like that, right? This is the same basic structure you would have. So we have our view, we have our various data binding, we have some of the custom attributes that AngularJS adds, and then behind the scenes, we had our controller that was defining various functions and data that we can use. So that was covering the main three things of AngularJS, right? We have the model view controller, we have data binding, and we have extending HTML with various attributes. There's one more thing I want to cover real quick, which is routing, which is moving between controllers. So routing is not part of core AngularJS, but pretty much any application out there is going to need routing because you're going to have more than sort of one page, right? You're going to want the user to be able to click between various different things. So, as I said, routing not part of the core Angular, right? Basically, it associates a URL with a controller and a view. So as the user navigates through your application by clicking various URLs, it swaps out the controller and the view, so the user can see, so you can basically transition between different areas of your application. And really the best way to demonstrate this is just to go ahead and build an application with AngularJS. So let's go ahead and do that. So I have a simple API here running on 480. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to sort of clone DistroWatch, right? So DistroWatch is like an old venerable application, right? I'm sure most of us have experience with it. So it's basically just sort of a list of Linux distributions, and then you can click into a Linux distribution, get a screenshot and some more information about the specific distribution that you clicked on. So I just have like I have a very basic API here. So I can go to API/distros and get just some summary information about a bunch of Linux distributions. So for example, we have Ubuntu, we have the Ubuntu logo, and then we just have a quick summary of Ubuntu. And then this is Ubuntu is ID 1. So if we go to API distros/1, then we get some more detailed information about that distribution, right? For example, now we have a description, we have a screenshot, we have some stats. That's one of the things that DistroWatch tracks, is sort of like the hits per day. So we have that information. So we can go ahead and start building an AngularJS application using this API. Okay, can everyone see that okay in terms of font size?
Yay, tiling.
Okay. Yes. All right, so here we just have sort of an empty page, right? As we go, we just see it's like a mug DistroWatch sort of thing. We're including our AngularJS application. So the first thing we want to do is call into this summary API. And just as sort of to get something on the page, let's go ahead and display a list of all the distributions we have at our disposal. So I'm going to go ahead and make a controller called distro list controller, and it's going to make an HTTP request out to the API, and it's going to take the response of that and just put it on the scope so then we can print it out in the view. So that's pretty straightforward. We're making a GET request to our URL, which is API/distros. And then once we get back a response of the distros, we're just going to go ahead and put that on the scope variable, right? So we'll just call that distros and take the variable we got back from the web API call and put that on the distros object. So now we want to go ahead and output it. So just like we saw in some of the code examples, for now, our body is just going to be the view. Let's go ahead and so we want to say for each distro in our distros list.
Is versus in.
For distros, oh, thank you, in distros. Let's go ahead and just output distro.name. And if I've done everything correctly, when we refresh this page, okay, there's our list of distributions coming back from our API. And so we also have some various things we could do, like this is just our distro object that's coming straight from our API. So we have access to, say, the summary. So let's go ahead and just put that in p tag or something. Refresh, and now we have our information coming from the So now, the next thing we want to do is we want to have some sort of link, right? So when we say click Ubuntu or something like that, right? We go into the information about that distribution. So we're going to go ahead and do that via another controller. So right now we have a distro list controller. Let's go ahead and make a singular distro controller for looking at one Linux distribution. It's going to be pretty similar in that we are going to be making an AJAX request and putting the result on the scope. So I'll just go ahead and grab this real quick. It's going to be a different URL, which I'll get to in a second. Right? We're going to be doing something there, right? Because you have to somehow get that ID so it can pull up the specific distro. But otherwise, it's going to be very similar structure, right? We're just going and getting the information and outputting it. So this is where the routing comes in that I mentioned before. So like I said, that's part of not part of core Angular, right? That's just an extension. So let's see, it's Angular route that we'll pull in. Yeah, so it's from the core Angular team. Up until about a version ago, like up till maybe 2 months ago, it was shipped as part of core Angular. But they've actually sort of split that out, and so now you only pull it in if you need it. But most applications do end up needing it. So we're going to have to go ahead and actually sort of register that plugin with our application. So we're going to go ahead and give our module a name. Let's call it distro watch. And we're going to say it uses the ng route plugin. So at this point, we've pulled in our routing plugin, and we just need to configure it, right? We somehow need to map these URLs to the various controllers and views. So we're going to do that like this with a function saying we have a route provider. And so this route provider object is what we use to actually configure and map our URLs. So we can say, like, we want to map the root URL to the controller distro list controller. Similarly, let's say when we're at the distro/ID URL, we're going to pull up the distro controller. So this ID variable right here, this sort of placeholder, is what we're going to use here to replace this sort of unknown that we had earlier. So it's via route params. That's another thing that Angular knows how to inject. And so now we said we're using $ID as our placeholder, so we can replace this question mark params.id. And so now when our distro list controller, or when our distro controller is navigated to via this URL, this ID placeholder, the value that's there in the URL, will then be on our route params object for our ID. And then there's one last thing. Right now, we just have our view just straight up in the body of the document, right? And since we have two controllers, we're going to need two views. Right, one to display the list of Linux distributions, and one to display the actual Linux distribution details. So right here, we're associated with the controller. We're also going to type in a view URL. And I actually have these views existing, so you guys don't have to watch me like write HTML and CSS. Let's see, I think it's templates, distro list, templates, distro. Thank you. All right. One more thing we have to do is we have this. We named our application now. We named it distro watch. So just to the side, we have to say our app is now distro watch. That's just like a little gotcha there. So by default, if you have just a single unnamed application in Angular, it just assumes that's the application you want. As soon as you start naming things, right, then you have to configure and say, okay, now I want to use this distro watch application. But now we're going to see how well I did this from memory. Oh, no, oh, that's one more thing. So right now, we still have our own, like our template right here, right? So we're gonna go ahead and just put a div. We're gonna use this ngView attribute, and Angular will know when we navigate to our controller, it knows what the view template is. It'll take whatever our view template is, fill in with the data, and then plug that into ngView. Here. Okay. So let's see what's going on here. Okay, so we have our distro list controller, making our distros API call. Getting back our response. Oh, I think I know what the issue. I probably have this AngularJS routing. Let's see. Go ahead and take this real quick. Get that actual template. Okay, that's the issue. Okay, so yeah, instead of URL.
Yeah.
We have hey, there we go. Okay. So now we have this. I have some custom CSS going on as well.
Yeah, so say all of a sudden
Right,
colors and
right. That's a
icons.
little bit of the magic behind the
Created
scenes.
a template
We can
for
take a look at the templates. So here's our distro list, right? This is the template we're using for the distro list. You can see it's sort of it's basically the same thing we had earlier, right? The core issue is we have this ng repeat, and for each distro in our distros collection that's on our controller. Now we're just outputting we're outputting the image, for example, that we're getting back from our API call. But we still have the name and the summary, and I have some CSS behind the scenes that's actually doing some stuff now. So see, we have this read more link, and then we're saying the link to it is /distro/ we have a distro.id, right? And that's what we defined in our distro.
May I have your attention? The time is now 8:30 and the library will be closing in 30 minutes at 9 p.m. Please be advised that the internet connections will shut down approximately 10 minutes before closing. Thank you.
Okay, so that link is basically just triggering this route, right? So when they click on that link, the browser just navigates to distro/ID. That's going to summon the distro controller. So go ahead and give that a link, quick. Let's see, so there's another issue.
So did clicking that link actually do a get?
Clicking that link, you can see we're doing this hash symbol right there in the URL.
Oh, okay.
So that is actually not
Right.
fully reloading the page, right? AngularJS is intercepting that since it's a URL
Right.
fragment.
Okay.
There is an HTML5 navigation mode as well. So then you can use some HTML5 features to get rid of this hash mark right there. So let's see. Oh, okay, that's the issue. Yeah, so I have my URL wrong here. API distro is API distros/1. Okay. There we go. So now when I refresh, now we actually get back our stuff. So now you see Ubuntu, Fedora, OpenSUSE. And so just for For completeness, let's go ahead and just, the last thing we haven't quite taken a look at yet is the single distro template. But there's nothing surprising here, right? Just a simple little bit of HTML. We have our distro object. And so we output the name as the title. Go ahead and navigate to it. Name is the title. We have a website link. It hits this week. So here's our website link, just to the URL. Hits this week. We have our screenshot image, and then we just have a description and just some like minor styling. So that's the whirlwind tour of AngularJS.
Wow.
Any questions?
So I'm sort of trying to figure out the context of this.
Sure.
It looks like it's a real compact language, very powerful, and there's just getting to be a lot of stuff out there. I'm just wondering if you see this as something that's going to be mainstream, or is this going to be like a specialty type of language?
I think we'll see it for these sort of web applications that are sort of rich, right? Where you want sort of like a lot of AJAX communication. So if you think of something like, even something like Google.com, nowadays when we search, right, it's loading all this sort of like via AJAX. So for these applications where we want this like super sort of responsive thing, I think we will see it. There's actually a ton of different frameworks out there that are competitors with AngularJS. In this regard, so I think it's a pretty rich ecosystem that we'll see a lot more in.
Have you seen this, or have you actually used other ones besides this?
I have. I've used AngularJS and I've used Durandal.js, which are both very, very similar. I think Rick uses like a YUI, which has a similar sort of thing, like a similar sort of model view controller thing. So I've looked at it a little bit, although I couldn't do it justice. I haven't looked at it enough to have an opinion on it.
So how big is the minified?
What's that?
How big is the minified AngularJS?
Okay, let's take a look real quick. So it is 97 kilobytes.
Pretty good.
And you put that on like CDN or something like that, you get the cache. It's not too bad at all.
How many ng dash things are there?
There's quite a few.
Welcome to the problems.
So let's see, if we go to API reference, you can see this is mostly it's around events, right? Say you want like a blur event or a focus event, right?
Click, yeah.
Yeah, click. That's where most of them are, right? So, okay, that's them pretty much right there. There, I just scroll past, and we have like, I guess I'm pointing to my screen. That doesn't use it, right? So you can ng value. You see like our ng repeat, and then as I scroll up, that. So, I mean, it's a handful, but it's
It's
definitely
like 50,
manageable,
yeah, maybe
right?
50
Especially
something.
because most of them are events based, right? So we know our click, our double click, our focus, right? That sort of thing.
How long did it take you to be proficient with it?
Very good.
So there's a couple levels of proficiency, right? Like the sort of stuff we did here, that's pretty quick to get up and going, right? I mean, it's probably just sit down one day and just do a couple hours work, right? You'll be able to do stuff pretty quickly, right? There's this whole side of Angular we didn't quite get a chance to cover, which is custom tags, right? So Angular gives you the ability to sort of add these, or has like these pre-built attributes and tags and stuff like that. You can add your own if it makes sense for your application. So one thing we could do here, it doesn't quite make sense for our application, but we could say make a distro tag, right? So this HTML list right here would just be a list of distro tags. Each one of these would be a distro tag. And so then getting into that sort of thing, like these custom HTML tags, that's sort of like another step of thing. But that's sort of how you can have like reusable widgets across your AJAX page, is by making these custom tags. So maybe you want a calendar control some of that. You can make a calendar tag or something like that.
Do you know specific sites that are built with this?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So actually, I think there's even a site that does that.
List the sites.
I list some of them, the ones that report themselves. And Google doesn't use this for like Gmail or anything like that, right? They do use it for some of their other sites. They have some admin portals that use AngularJS. I think they're one of their, DoubleClick, I think, uses AngularJS, something like that. But then you see like some of these more app sort of things, right? Like the YouTube app on PS3 is built with AngularJS, right? That's apparently a web application.
Is there anything telltale in the URL or anything like that?
No, not really. I mean, you can definitely look at the source,
You can look
right,
at the
to look at
source,
AngularJS,
right.
but there's
You can't tell.
there's no real way you can tell just like looking at the UI.
Very cool.
It is really cool. Wow.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.